As always, I understand that your time and attention are extremely valuable, so the fact that you're in this video compels me to want to give you something of high value. If you're exchanging your time and energy for me, I want to make sure you get something in return of equal or greater value. Today, I want to talk about something that's just super fresh on my heart and my mind and my experience, and that's this idea of healthy boundaries. Now, I've heard about boundaries for a long time. In fact, gosh, about 30 years ago, I went on a golf trip out to the Palm Springs area, and I got teamed up with Henry Cloud. Henry Cloud is an author, a speaker, a psychologist, and he co-wrote the Boundaries book with John Townsend. And I ended up golfing with Henry. He was an extremely good golfer, and I wasn't. So we didn't spend a ton of time together because I was often out chasing my ball. But the time we did spend together, I was just picking his brain about what are boundaries. And here's why I was asking, because I didn't really understand the concept, right? When I was young, my boundaries kind of got destroyed through a lot of circumstances that were less than ideal, right? That weren't fun, particularly a 3-year period from 11 to 14 when I lived with my stepfather, and he had no understanding of boundaries, and so he didn't respect any of ours, and he stepped on them, over them, kicked them, crushed them. And in fact, there was this weird thing that happened during those years, and that is that my tear ducts, they broke. They stopped working. It wasn't that I was telling myself, hey, don't cry. And I did grow up in the era where big boys don't cry, and you got to suck it up, shake it off, and wipe the dirt off, spit on it and move on, which is actually very valuable. I learned a lot from my own father, who was one of the toughest guys I've ever met. But as a result, his interactions with me were very stoic, right? Be tough, Joe. Be tough like me. And I love that. I wanted to be tough like my dad. But on the other side, he wasn't very nurturing, right? He figured that was my mom's job. And my mom actually was very nurturing, thankfully. But I didn't have the role model father that was, huggy and saying I love you a lot. And yet I was kind of wired that way. I'm quite gregarious and outgoing and touchy-feely, and I love all that kind of stuff. I'm a hugger for sure. But in that 3-year period where my mom had married this other guy, it was a slow descent into numbness, because the guy was overbearing. He was just mean. He was self-centered. He would say anything and everything that came to mind, whether it was appropriate or not. And I know now, as I look back, that he was just doing what he'd been taught. Hurt people, and he was a hurt person, sure, so he was hurting us. But I was a kid, so I thought, as a father figure, as an adult, as an authority, that this is the way it is. That was the model I was receiving. But as I said, there was this point somewhere in that 11 to 14 span where my tears just stopped. I'd been intimidated so many times. I cried so many times because of this domineering presence that would get in my face. He never touched me physically, but deep down inside, things were just breaking all over the place. And so my tears just stopped. And I didn't really think that much about it. In fact, I kind of took it as a badge of courage. I'm tough now, right? I got toughened up, so that was a good thing. But there was a period I went until probably my wedding at age 32 before I cried, and then back to normal, which normal for me meant no tears, until my kids were born. I cried again when I was at age 40. So from 14 to 32, cried once, again at 40. You can see that something's wrong with this picture. And yet, I didn't even think anything was wrong, right? I just thought, I'm good, I'm tough. Things happen, I can shrug it off, I'm cool. Well, that worked really well to get me through those tough years, but it certainly didn't work very well as I became an employee, when I became a husband, and when I became a dad, that I could adapt to anything, but I wasn't really facing anything. I wasn't dealing with anything. I was just like, let's just let it go. We're gonna be fine, take a positive attitude and move on. So if there is such thing as toxic positivity, I suppose I was the role model, or the model child for that, model child in an adult body. But what I'm realizing now, tying it back to this boundaries idea, is that healthy boundaries, right, that are an understanding of what is acceptable treatment of others and what's acceptable treatment towards me, those have been obliterated, and I didn't even know it. And so I didn't have a healthy sense of true boundaries in the healthiest sense of the word. So I would allow anything to happen because, hey, I can absorb it, I can take it, I'm tough enough. And yeah, it might hurt or whatever, but it's not gonna last very long. And so I would just let people treat me however they treated me, and it wasn't healthy. It wasn't healthy for me, right? But I thought I was being loving. I thought I was being caring because I wasn't being demanding, right? I wasn't holding anybody at arm's length. What I didn't understand until way later in my life, very recently in fact, is that by not holding a true boundary, a safe boundary for myself, I actually was harming the other person as well in the relationship, because I was drawing the line or not drawing the line as to what was acceptable behavior. So it wasn't their fault, right? It wasn't their fault that I had no boundaries. It was my fault. It was my responsibility, or lack thereof, no ability to respond. So I was training other people how to treat me. Why? Because I didn't know. I didn't even know how to treat me. I didn't know what healthy boundary was. I thought that self-love was somehow selfish, right? And so I didn't want to have any walls. I didn't want to have any barriers. I didn't want to have any boundaries. And when I hear the phrase that healthy fences make for great neighbors, inside of me I'm like, that's not true. Fences are like wall people off. It separates people. Why would you want? I would rather have open range, right? Just saying open range reminded me of how important fences are. As you may know, I grew up in Montana, and in Montana, at least in those days, cattle outnumber people 6-1. You can't go very far in Montana without seeing cows. And occasionally, you'll see a cow like out on the road, which is quite dangerous because if you hit it with a car, it may or may not kill the cow, but it could kill you, right? And cows don't know any better. So they'll wander out onto the road, they'll wander into a ditch. And so fences are built for the cow's safety, right? The cow doesn't know. So by building the fence and putting a little electric shock in there, it reminds the cow, hey, don't go that way. Not because you're in trouble, because you'll get hurt or lost if you go that way. And cattle guards, same thing. Cattle guards in the road, you drive over them, right? I remember that as a kid, makes your teeth rattle. And that was so that the cattle wouldn't walk over there, because that was the entrance to the highway or to the road or where they would get lost. And so I spent countless summers on my dad's place or my grandpa's place helping repair fences that had been torn down by the winter or cows pushed up against it or whatever, because if I didn't repair the fences, again, the cows would get hurt. So it was actually a loving thing towards the cows. It wasn't restrictive, it wasn't overbearing, it was actually healthy for them. And I thought, wow, that I never saw that. Even though I grew up in that, I never saw that by me creating a healthy boundary, healthy fences around my heart, my emotions, around myself, isn't to wall people off, is to show them when you cross this line, it's going to hurt you. A lack of healthy boundaries makes victims out of both parties. And that is super important to keep in mind. If you've seen the movies The Black Panther or Wakanda Forever, what you see is this invisible force field that keeps the city hidden and protected from all enemies. In fact, the enemies don't even know that the force field's there until they get to it, and then they push up against it and it sends them back. They cannot, it's impervious. They can't get inside. But if you're a member of Wakanda, if you're part of the community or you're an ally, you can pass right through that force field because you're not a threat. Very interesting, right? This is a great picture of a healthy boundary, is it sets the parameters as to where your friends, your loved ones, how close they can get, but it also keeps out those who would want to cause you harm, whether they are doing it on purpose or unintentionally. And so I realized that, the boundaries isn't so much of a wall or even a fence. It's more like this force field, this protective force field that allows those who love you and want what's best for you to pass through without any problem. But it does set a boundary for those who don't care about you. They're either only caring about themselves or they're trying to cause you harm. And to ground this idea in my own experience, very recently, I was working at an event with a bunch of people, and I wasn't in charge of it, I was just there to help, right? Several times throughout the day, I would do something that I thought was extremely helpful, and an authority that was responsible for the event would kind of reprimand me with this really negative tone right in front of everybody else, like publicly. It was rather humiliating and embarrassing, and it was hurtful too. And I was like, why take a tone with me like that when I'm here to assist you, to make sure that you are successful? And it happened enough times throughout the day. My normal mode was just suck it up, don't say anything. I kept my smile on my face. I was cheerful about taking care of and doing my job. But when the event was over, before I even went home, I just had this sudden sense that this is a chance for me, a ripe opportunity for me to exercise and to establish healthy boundaries, because mine weren't in place and they were being trampled on. And again, I'm not going to blame anybody other than me, because I'm the only one responsible for maintaining my healthy fences. So what I did, I stopped before I even got home, and I got my laptop out, and I just created an email to the one person in particular that it was just really bothering me. And I didn't take a tone of accusation. I just took a tone of, I don't know if you're aware, but when you did this or said this, I really hurt. I didn't understand where you're coming from, and it felt like I was in trouble for trying to help. Please help me understand this, because I don't like how that feels, and I don't know that that's what you intended, and I'm not going to assume, because I know that assuming makes an ass out of you and me. That's the way it's spelled, right? So I just left it as an open-ended question. Can we talk about this so that it doesn't keep happening? And I got to tell you, just composing that email was way outside of my typical response to these type of things. Normally I just go home, go to sleep, and the next day on to the next thing. But it just seemed like this was almost like a call to maturity, like a chance to grow up just one more step. And I hesitated for the longest time whether or not I should even send it. I went back through it several times. I reworded it so that it didn't sound like I was attacking anybody. And with great courage, I hit the send button. And gosh, just within seconds, I got a text on my phone, and the person that I sent it to said, "Hey, let's talk about this tomorrow. I'm happy to talk about it." I don't know if they were happy to talk about it or not, but they responded immediately, and like mixed emotions inside. I'm like, oh, is that good or bad? Right? So I didn't sleep great that night. Because the last thing I wanted was to cause more problems or to strain the relationship. Right? This is someone I respect. I want them to respect me as well. But that's the key, and I didn't get it. It was that by setting a healthy boundary and repairing these fences, I was actually giving respect to myself and showing another person how to respect me, that I am worthy of this respect. And I had to believe that, right? It's part of my mindset. So the next day, we go into the meeting, and at first I'm very anxious about what's going to happen, believing for the best, expecting the worst, right? And there was a lot of tension at first. There was a lot of back and forth and some defensive-ness and all that kind of stuff, which is totally to be expected. But in the end, each of us got to express, here's what we did and here's the why. Here's what happened behind it. Because both of us had an assumption that the other person's actions meant something, which we assumed, right, from our vantage point, it meant something. And so in the absence of information, we just filled in the blanks. And then in this conversation, a give and take, lots of questions, we were each able to express, here's what I did, and I know you took it this way, here's what I meant and why, and go back and forth as to what could we do differently next time. And quite honestly, it couldn't have ended any better than it did. By the end, we're both kind of tearing up, realizing that there's a lot of misinterpretation, a lot of misunderstanding, which neither one of us intended, and we had an amazing embrace, a hug, a shared sense of love and respect. And I tell you, I walked out of that meeting feeling 40, 50 pounds lighter than when I walked in. And it's like a milestone, right? It's a milestone in my life, one that I stopped and was aware of my boundaries they're out of whack. The fences are broken. Something's wrong because I'm being treated in a way that I don't think I deserve. And rather than just accuse the other person and assume where they're coming from, I created an email that said, here's what happened, here's how it made me feel, what's your side of the story? Because I can only see my side. And so I think it's going to be a demarcation line for me to prove what I have begun to believe, and that is that boundaries are not selfish. They're actually loving to me and to others. And I think the word I would use now instead of boundaries, because it makes more sense to me, is guardrails, right? And it came to mind while I was thinking about this whole thing that the guardrail wasn't built for the person who put it in. It was for the people driving up and down the road so they can navigate safely. And that's really important for me to say, if I'm gonna build a boundary, if I'm gonna maintain a fence, if I'm gonna put up a force field, it's to protect me, but it's also to protect others from getting off the rails, from crashing, from hurting themselves or hurting others. That's actually a loving thing to do. So I highly encourage you to identify where the boundaries are broken in your life, where people are mistreating you, and realize that that's something that you're allowing, and take responsibility, right? Not that you forced anybody or made somebody mistreat you, but you allowed it to happen. And so your responsibility is really two words, not one. It's your responsibility, your ability to respond. Once you are aware of that, what do you do now, right? You step into that discomfort and realize this is an opportunity to heal and to grow and to learn and to offer love both to yourself and to those who you love. So think of healthy boundaries as a membrane that will keep out your enemies, that will filter the things that are coming in and out, so that you can then exhale, push back out through the boundary, through that membrane of what doesn't belong in you, what doesn't belong to you, really belongs to someone else. So I hope this makes sense to you. I hope this is helpful. And as always, I say inspiration, ideation without implementation is just delusion. So take action, whatever steps those are. They don't have to be big. It doesn't have to be a quantum leap, but just be aware of this and do these little things, where you speak up for yourself, not being defensive or attacking, just saying, hey, did you know I don't like the way that feels. I feel like I'm being mistreated. Why did you do this? Where are you coming from? And have the dialogue that can create the healing. As one of my friends says, the conversations are the cure. That's not always the case, but it certainly can be. So my prayer, my hope for you is that you too will step into this idea that boundaries are not walls. They're healthy membranes to keep in what belongs and to keep out what doesn't and what's toxic. Bless you all.